Floyd, Sean Reed, Nina Pop, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, David McTee, and all the other lives that have been lost at the hands of state-sanctioned violence. And if we could just have a moment of silence and acknowledgement, that would be wonderful. Thank you for that. Also, just want to acknowledge that it's not simply the lives that have been lost that really have prompted us to come here today, but really the outpouring of grief, rage, but overall solidarity that we've seen break out in an almost unprecedented way, beginning at the end of May and really carrying through the month of June and now into the summer, around demands for much of what we're going to talk about today in terms of criminal justice reform. And this is not a new phenomenon. With my historian's hat on, we could have a long conversation about the ways in which demands for criminal justice reform, prison abolition, racial justice have shaped kind of the social movement and political landscape for decades now. And I'm not going to take us down that road. I'm not going to have that conversation, but I just want to note that many of the points that our panelists will be raising will really call attention to the fact that this is kind of an immediate moment that we're in, but one that has a much longer history and genealogy. Beyond that, I just want to also note that we've really been, in the last half decade, really been in a moment of really intense activism and organizing, as well as scholarship that's focused on kind of the state of our criminal justice system, right? For those who don't know, the United States leads the world in the number of people who are behind bars, upwards of 2.2 million, and who are under some degree of state supervision, roughly around 7 million, such that a significant portion of the people behind bars around the world, a significant portion, close to a quarter, are held here in the United States. That is a dynamic that's been challenged by prisoner organizing and movements behind bars, as well as most recently the Black Lives Matter protests that have broken out, inspired in many ways by the uprising that took place in Ferguson, Missouri. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there's been really that sort of recent, very dynamic social movement history to kind of help balance the fact that so many of the sort of outbreak of protests that's taken place over the past several weeks has really called into question a variety of different things that are taking place in our society, right? Not simply the question of state-sanctioned violence, but also the handling of the coronavirus pandemic, the really depression level scale of unemployment and underemployment that our communities face at this moment in time, and really the stark partisan nature of our polarized partisan nature of our politics. Those are just a couple of the elements that have kind of fueled the drive for folks to go to the streets and to be involved in protest, as well as just a general demand for justice. And it's really worth acknowledging that because of the years of work that's been done by a host of different organizations, some of those connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, some connected to other broader movements, that has created an opening and created an opportunity for people to really voice their sense of frustration and kind of signal a degree of lack of faith or a sense of lack of legitimacy in terms of the way in which our society is operating at this moment. And so as a result of that, we see a variety of different demands. Some of them are for kind of basic reforms and sort of tweaks to the way in which the criminal justice system operates. Some of them are broader, such that they're calling either for defunding police to abolishing police and abolishing prisons. And it's really kind of in the spectrum between those questions of sort of basic reform and broader scale abolition, and really the opening in which these protests, the recent uprisings have called into question the way our society operates, and have given us an opportunity to kind of think more concretely about the kind of world that we want to live in and the ways that we want to relate to each other, that we really have an opportunity to kind of get a sense of at this moment in time. So I just want to highlight that there's a kind of a really unique moment that we're wrestling with, and many of us are sort of searching for ways to kind of better understand and make sense of it. And we're really fortunate that we have the scholars on this panel today who can kind of frame a sense of what that spectrum from kind of reform to abolition looks like, and what are some of the ways in which that is touching on different aspects, different institutions within our broader criminal justice system. So I want to introduce the scholars as we have them in the, we've put them in the information communicating this event. We're fortunate to have a range of folks who are at different stages of their academic careers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with Nathalie Amazan, and we'll have them go first. And then after Nathalie goes, I'll introduce the subsequent scholars, and we'll go from there. And just starting with Nathalie, I just want to note that I was the second reader on their amazing undergraduate thesis. And it's not because of that reason that I'm asking them to go first, but we named them first in the kind of introductory materials that was sent out. So we'll just kind of keep it in that way. So Nathalie is a 2020 graduate of UMass Amherst, where she studied political science, Afro-American studies, and legal studies, specializing in law and social justice. Her senior thesis is titled The Carceral Contract and Praxis for Liberation Through Abolition. I'll pass it to Nathalie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that, Professor Losier. I was really hoping I wouldn't go first. I wanted to hear everyone else go, take some good notes, kind of inform what I was going to talk about, but you put me on the hot seat, and so I hope I can deliver. But I just first want to say thank you to Professor Rowan, to you, Professor Losier, as well, for not only being my part of my committee for my thesis, but also for this event, moderating and giving that necessary introduction. And thank you for everyone who came out today to want to be a part of this discussion. I think, this moment is calling for all of us to really commit to building the type of world that we want to live in, the type of society that we deserve to live in. And this conversation is a part of that work. So thank you for doing your part and being here. And I hope that this can inspire, can inspire and can lead to doing more and embodying more and as we move forward. So if I'm being honest, I was very flustered with like what I wanted to really tackle with the 10 minutes I have. My thesis itself is almost an 80-page project, and I know that that's not something I'm just gonna go through in this time. I wanted to, really highlight the main points that I think are relevant for our discussion right now. And so I just want to start it off by just saying that for me, liberation work is something that I see as a duty for myself, for the people, for my communities, and for the world that we live in. I think we all have a mandate to know where injustice is and to work towards resolving it, and for all people and our future communities to come. And so in order to do that, I have embodied an abolitionist framework of what social justice looks like for me. And abolition for me is a very holistic, creative social justice process that has been nurtured throughout my college career. And that of me being an abolitionist, that politic has really informed my own research and has informed my own artistic interest as a poet and writer. But for purposes of this webinar, I'm just going to be talking about my research that went into my senior thesis and how it is relevant for our current moment in this global reckoning. Can you all hear me okay? If I can get some thumbs up. Okay, perfect. So as Professor Losier said, my thesis title is called The Carceral Contract and Praxis for Liberation Through Abolition. He, along with Professor Angelica Bernal in the Political Science Department, were a part of guiding me through the process of this thesis, where the purpose of it is to advance an argument that says white supremacy, understood as an interconnected system of racism, neoliberal capitalism, and heteropatriarchy, completely manifests itself through the US carceral system. And by the carceral system, I mean jails, prisons, immigration detention centers, policing, state surveillance, the criminal legal system. All of these things make up the carceral apparatus. And this manifestation of white supremacy, more than just the idea of white superiority or racism, but all of these things, all of these different systems of power all these different systems that play into the larger system of power that white supremacy is affirmed by the consent, implicit and explicit, of Americans, situating it in the US context. And so the idea for that research is situated in the understanding of the racial contract by Charles Mills, who, just like background on that, is a political philosopher of Jamaican descent who understood white supremacy as well as a system that encompasses policy, morale, economics, and epistemology, how we think about each other and the world, how we know what is true or what is not true, and how that racial contract is the reality of the common social contract that we hear of, that we give up our natural rights to the sovereign, to our government for safety, for protection, for liberty, and we enter into this body politic where we have rights to vote, where we have security in our person and property. And so Mills says that social contract is in fact the racial contract that is implicated based on the ideas of people's, or the naming of people's race and the exploitation of people's bodies, lands, and their resources for the purposes of colonization and imperialism and all of those things. And the part of that racial contract that is most relevant for my carceral contract idea is the idea that this racial contract continues to be renewed unless it's completely abolished. And it continues to manifest itself in different ways throughout history because it has not been abolished. And so in this moment that we're living in right now, I understand that white supremacy right now works in a way that that we have policing and prisons and all the different technologies of the carceral system, that all of those things maintain and constantly renew the white supremacist state that we live in, the state that has never reckoned with our past and the atrocities that it has done and continues to do, and continues to perpetuate policy and practices that continue to enshrine white supremacy as the norm of this state. And so throughout this thesis, in order to make that argument clear and concise, I go through just different historical periods in the US in terms of understanding how the carceral has become more of a normalized, accepted function in our society. And so I think it's important to start with the 13th Amendment. For those, I think it's widely known or is getting more popularized now that the 13th Amendment is the amendment that has abolished chattel slavery, except for punishment for a crime. And this arguably is where we see the shift of white supremacy as something completely over, a stark observation of white superiority, to one that is beginning to shift towards the carceral apparatus. And I think you can also make the argument that slavery itself is a carceral statehood. Dennis Childs, who his work has as well informed my thesis and my thinking, makes the argument of slavery was a carceral existence as well. And so that has just been an endemic feature of our society. But regardless, for purposes of my thesis and the research, I understand the 13th Amendment as kind of like the beginning of that for us, and that shifting towards the Black codes and towards convict leasing system, and really seeing the ways in which particularly Black people have been continued to be kept at a subjugated class in society, one that is constantly controlled by the state and controlled by the power system of white supremacy. And so understanding the Black codes, convict leasing system, all the way through the Jim Crow period, through the neoliberal turn in the 80s to now, seeing the ways that Black, Indigenous, poor, working class people, queer people are constantly being controlled by white supremacy. And I include all those different identities because of the understanding that white supremacy as a system of power does not only impact those who are Black or people of color, but wow, 2 minutes. Okay, let me speed it up. But that impacts all of us and impacts those who are not the ones who are privileged by it. And so through all this understanding, I think that today, how we see it operating through the carceral system is through exploitative prison policies, the ways that different court systems use fines and fees to entrap low-income people into debt, as we've seen in Ferguson, criminalizing homelessness, and of course the inherent criminalization of people of color, as seen by the murders that have been a part of our history for forever. And so with all of that, I think that leads us to question, what do we do about this? Is this just, a permanent feature of America? And I reject that. I think that there is, that abolition offers a way to change and to holistically kind of restructure the way that our society operates. And if I could for a moment just share my screen, I want to share a definition of abolition as understood by Critical Resistance, which is a pioneer organization in understanding abolition. I hate having a lot of words on my PowerPoints, but I think it's important for us to just understand what we're talking about, understanding abolition as this broad strategy of eliminating imprisonment, policing, surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to a world where these things are no longer the norm. And I think that it's important to understand that because it is a broad strategy, that there are different ways to engage in this praxis of what does abolition look like? How do we actually get there? And part of it's, there's a lot of different parts of abolition, and I think so there's three quick parts of it that I highlight throughout my thesis. Is one, understanding ourselves as agents of our own freedom, especially understanding those who are incarcerated, the 7 million people who are under the direct control of our carceral system through imprisonment, probation, and parole, understanding them especially as those who are closest to the problem and closest to the solution, and understanding it, and understanding that we need to be able to heed the demands of those who are the ones most impacted, and centering them in our work, and understanding the idea of healing, and understanding the idea of generational and historical and statewide healing that needs to happen, and really trying to embodying practices within our daily lives that challenge our own normalized ideas of what it means to enact justice, and what it means to relate to one another. If we are going to create a different type of society to live in, then we need to embody different ways of living. And part of that as well is using art in our praxis of using art to reflect and imagine and to push ourselves beyond what seems possible. And so I think I can just end it there briefly, and we can go more into it during the discussion. But I just want to kind of start it off there of just, understanding that abolition is really that deep commitment to change, and the deep commitment to doing the actual policy changes now that will lead to reducing harm, but and the long-term goal of understanding that, this world that we have endured for the past 400 plus years is no longer viable. It's never been viable, and that it's something that we are continuing to change, and we will continue to change.
Cool. Thank you, Nathalie. And apologies if I was trying to like pick up on the cues, but I guess I read them wrong. So my mistake. And much appreciated. And obviously, we're going to continue the conversation a bit in the question and answer session, and definitely have some want to follow up and want to ask you a bit more about a couple things that you raised. But for the time being, I'm going to turn to Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve, who is a sociologist and legal scholar from Brown University. She's the author of the acclaimed book, Cook County, Racism and Injustice in America's Largest Criminal Court, which is the winner of 11 awards or finalist distinctions for its contributions to the areas of sociology, law, criminal justice, and media. Her new book, The Waiting Room, is part of the series The South Side from Amazan Original Stories, and is a collaboration with the Pulitzer Prize winning team at the Marshall Project. So I'm going to pass it to Nicole, and really look forward to hearing her share her thoughts.
Thank you. So I feel like I'm like the OG on the panel here. So I'm just on the other side of tenure. And what's interesting is that, like Nathalie, I started my scholarship as an undergraduate. So the earliest field notes in Crook County emerged from my being an undergrad, walking into the criminal courthouse in Chicago at 26 in California. And everything that I had learned in my political science class looked nothing like what I was promised. And I think from that visceral gut reaction, all the books that I continued to read in political science and in sociology, none of them spoke to the visual reality, the absolute reality of walking into that court and seeing a stream of Black and Latino defendants that comprised the case docket for the day, and the mostly white attorneys that were tasked with managing this, this group of people as though it was a caseload. I mean, that was the first, nothing I had read up until that point in the late 90s would provide a clear picture of what it was. And it wasn't until I started going back to grad school that we started naming it, calling it mass incarceration, mass imprisonment, the prison to industrial complex. There was, people started to theorize from a criminological lens, what is this? But imagine, walking in and not being able to name it. Imagine walking in and never reading Du Bois and understanding how to talk about racism. Meaning, what I was seeing in the practice of law and the language people were using was overt racism. They used the headshots or mugshots of, defendants as wallpaper, and everybody who made, all the convictions were posted up, and an all white attorney team was, showed me this showpiece, and they narrated, do you see the scum that we deal with? And that was my indoctrination. So, here I am as an undergrad thinking I'm going to study the organization of the courts, possibly some of the issues that Malcolm Feely and other, court ethnographers had seen in the past, in the 70s and 80s. How are they relevant today? And really the answer was they weren't, because none of them addressed the primary issue, was that this was a system that was organized along racial lines. And so really the start of this observation in grad school was saying, how do you have such a segregated system of mass incarceration? And how does that racialized nature then impact the systems itself, so that the systems are the impact, right? They're the end goal, right? We're describing the systems, rather than doing it from the defendant's point of view and saying, let's study the marginalized, which is pretty much the thrust of sociology. Let's study, largely people who've been marginalized by the system or abused. Why don't we study the people that create the conditions of marginality? So that the entire idea of creating a empirical project was thinking about studying the mostly white prosecutors, judges, public defenders, police officers, and sheriffs that created the conditions under which racism, both overt and subtle, could be mobilized to understand how the law worked. And that was kind of the task of the book, right? Is saying, how do we have these racial divides in mass incarceration, and how does the divides between who doles out justice and who receives punishment, how does that become a system that is layered through every level, right? Nested within itself. So, I try to take that on. How does the institution create cultural pieces and understandings? How do they create really racial slurs? Two dichotomous notions of a defendant. One is a mope, which is kind of it really, the notion of a mope type defendant signaled a type of crime that would be committed, a type of racialized being, so that the crime itself was intertwined with racial stigma. The other side was the notion of the monster. So this realization of a criminalized Black man as kind of having a natural monster-like persona. And so then the prosecutor's task is not deciding who is innocent and who is guilty and who deserves, it's really saying, which one are you? Which racialized being are you? It's a type of racial sorting, but also a legal process, and the two are inextricable. Now, I think one of the issues that I'd like to bring up, and for the younger scholars on the call, is that I will be honest with you, I was lucky in Northwestern sociology. I mean, the first task I was told honestly by an advisor was, do not do this in political science. They will not appreciate you. You will not finish your grad program. You will not get a job. So I was like, you don't have to tell me twice. And so this loving professor and mentor encouraged me to apply to a sociology department. But that didn't necessarily save me, right? So now you're in a soc department and there are no classes on race. There's no theory class that engages Du Bois on the color line. I have to hunt out classes on critical race, or to even be able to, have the language to be able to say, well, I'm seeing overt racial prejudice. I know when I see a racial slur, but how as a sociologist am I supposed to theorize as that having a purpose within the criminal justice system? And that was much harder to search for. And so I did surround myself with really excellent team of advisors and a support system. But in the Obama years, saying I'm going to study racism was like saying I'm going to study unicorns and rainbows. People would say to me, I don't understand. How does that exist? Right? Cultural theorists and cultural sociologists would say, well, I don't have anything to lend. And I was saying, so you're saying white attorneys can't practice racism as a culture, meaning it can't be culturally replicated. I can't be socialized into learning it, because I had all this ethnographic data showing that I could learn it. And that was a real struggle. So I realized publishing this type of work was also fighting a academic system that did not mentor nor allow graduate students and young faculty to build their careers critiquing or at least gazing upon the power brokers within the criminal justice system, right? It was more willing to do studies about marginalized people, but did not want studies of those who created the violence and created the systems of marginality. And that is one thing that I would not accept. I went to critical race scholars like Laura Gomez, that were within Law and Society tradition. So I love that this is a Law and Society program. Those are the scholars that surrounded me and supported me. They gave me the critical race reader. They made me read Kim Crenshaw. Laura Gomez wrote a presidential speech that said, looking for race in all the wrong places, and called out the legal academy and the socio-legal academy for its shallow treatment of race. I wrote a paper called Criminal Justice Through Colorblind Lenses. My co-author, I think she's still on there, Lauren Mays. We that was a dangerous, quote unquote, dangerous paper to write. It was a critique saying that criminal justice as a discipline, criminology as a discipline, will not acknowledge the existence of racism. It will not talk about the ways it's produced on a macro level, from structural racism to cultural practices within organizations and institutions to being reinforced within cognitive levels. It wants to talk about it only in ways that absolve the people who do the racism, right, from sounding non-racial or it's unintentional. And so that was kind of a call for scholars to step up and do more. And, so I'm wondering how much time do I have left? Do I have a few minutes or?
2 minutes. Just
2 minutes. Okay. So I think, that to me was the, academic, when we talk about the code of silence in policing, I do research on that, showing through data that prosecutors know about police perjury. They know about dead suspects. They know about torture. They know about planting drugs and fabricating cases. And from a system-wide standpoint, they do things within the prosecutor's office to overtly hide and obscure the existence of these cases. I've been working now with an attorney from the ACLU to talk about that in generalizable terms, not just in Chicago, but larger. And I think the code of silence and violence that intimidates the actual practitioners in law enforcement, as well as in the prosecutor's office and the judges sitting on the bench, has a similar quality to it in terms of academic fear. They will tell you, you will not be able to get a job. Do you expect to get a job by writing that paper? That's scary, right? Do you expect to get tenure by doing that work? That's really scary. You have a family to feed. Do you expect to go back into the city of Chicago by saying that truth? That's really scary. That's your physical safety. And so I think that is what we need to hold academic institutions accountable. When people study, have an activist standpoint, we demean them by using the word activism. When people are working alongside the police department and obscuring the truths that they know about how police cover up misconduct, that to me is a activism, meaning you have not told the truth about the data that you've seen. You are scared to go one step beyond and continue interviewing, collecting more data on how misconduct is not a one-off, but a systemic practice. And like any type of criminality, it can be studied like a sociologist. We can study it empirically. And I think, to me, I've talked about this idea of sociological malpractice. That is knowing about systemic violence and misconduct within abusive systems and staying silent in the hopes that others will tell that story. And if there's one thing I'd like to see changed, is for us as academics not to just sit in the ivory tower, but to us to have a commitment to continue translating findings in all ways through the media, op-eds, prison education to our students, so that we can understand these systems for what they are. And my hope is that good mentors can surround and support this younger generation of scholars so they don't have to try so hard to fight the system just to do the study. That's what I hope will change. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Next, I'm going to introduce Kayla Preito-Hodge, who is a student in the Department of Sociology and a recipient of an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship. Her research considers the experience of Black police officers and how they navigate their racial and organizational identities. And after after conducting really amazing research here at UMass Amherst, this fall, Kayla will be joining the faculty in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Rutgers campus. So, Kayla?
Can you guys hear me? Hi, again, my name is Kayla Preito-Hodge, and thank you so much, Jamie and Professor Losier, for organizing this panel and inviting me on. Professor Nicole Gonzalez and Cleve, I was on a panel, or was listening into a panel a few weeks ago, and then you definitely inspired my work in so many different ways. So just thought I'd put that out there. So again, I'm Kayla. About how I came to my project, I looked at Black police officers and their experiences navigating their racial and organizational identities in a large urban police department. I'm originally from Philly, and the reason I got into this work is because of my experiences growing up in the city of Philadelphia and the experiences that I had with police, both direct and indirect experiences. And so, you know, this was a kind of intimidating topic to even get into. This research project kind of emerged in the midst of the boom of the Black Lives Matter movement and the death of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner. And so I had an experience with a Black police officer, and prior to that, I never had any good experience with police officers. And again, those are both direct and indirect experiences. And so the summer of Michael Brown's death, I had a good experience with a police officer, which was contrary to what I had ever imagined experiencing, and it just really got me thinking sociologically about the issue of race and policing. Specifically, how are Black people who align themselves in police agencies reacting to issues around racialized police violence, and if they are actually reacting to them, and how do they fare within the actual police organization when they do react to them. And so again, my research considers their organizational experiences. So my dissertation looks at 48 police officers in a large urban police department that will go unnamed. And basically I've spent maybe 2 to 3 years collecting this data and just being in the presence of police officers and kind of just getting a sense of where they were attending community events that the Black Police Association put on and stuff like that. And I guess the overall thing that I've gotten from my research is that it's much more deeper than people could probably even imagine. It's not, you know, like we have these traditional calls for reform where it's like, oh, well, let's hire more racially diverse officers and this will kind of fix the issues that we have in policing, or let's increase community policing. And these are recommendations that are being called on currently in this conversation around George Floyd and the mass protests that have reached far and beyond just our nation. And so, again, what I've found is that even Black police officers have problems within the police department, very racialized experiences of racism, outright racism, both overtly and covertly, physical and non-physical. Yeah, and so I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, my research basically covers the entire not the entire Black police force, but a good portion of Black officers in the department. And again, their experiences have been racialized in ways that kind of implicates the department instead of individual officers. So there's commonly this notion that it's the bad apples, it's this individual officer, we need to arrest this one officer. But my research has found that all of the officers are actually implicated within these problematic behaviors of police departments and police forces more generally. It's not just the white officers, but it's also the Black officers who don't say anything. They might see something, but not actually say something. And that becomes a problem in so many different regards because, you know, if you don't see something and say something and you allow, just like what happened with George Floyd, you have several officers present and nobody actually speaks up, and a man winds up losing his life because nobody had the courage to speak up, or because of this organizational silence or this code of silence that is perpetuated throughout that has been perpetuated throughout the history of policing. And in particular, among Black officers, I feel like this silence is so much more pervasive because of the ramifications that come with being a Black officer in the police department, and the ramifications that come with speaking out against racism. Are there organizational avenues to report racism is one thing that I look at. And I find that, yeah, they have internal affairs units. However, these units aren't always adequate in reporting racialized or racist behaviors. And so I find that officers often don't report these behaviors because out of fear for their own lives, or just fear that the organization won't actually do anything. So we continue to perpetuate this cycle of violence, not just among white officers, but also among officers of color, and particularly Black officers. And yeah, so that's essentially my research. And I think one of the biggest fears that I've had in doing this work is the safety issue, but also being published in academia. So I've always felt like I have to be a lot more safe in doing this work because I am going into a criminal justice department. And so I will be published as a criminologist as opposed to a sociologist who may have more welcoming and less conservative ideas, if you might say. So I've been worried about being published and being taken seriously as a scholar who is studying race and policing, and specifically who is only studying Black police officers. So that's one of the other things that I think I've gotten pushback on in my time as a graduate student is, okay, so why just Black police officers? Why not also study white police officers? And I think that the context of Black police officers is so important in light of these recommendations that continually emerge to say, okay, well, let's just throw some Black officers in there and we'll fix everything. When in reality, that's not the case. And so, again, that's just the depth of my research, and I'd be happy to talk about it a little bit more with all of you.
Wonderful, thank you, Kayla. And then last but not least, we have Amber Powell, and she is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. Her research interests include the sociology of law, punishment, gender-based violence, and Black feminist theory. Her current dissertation research, examines sexual victimization within youth detention facilities in the Midwest. She has also conducted research on policing in Minneapolis and sexual assault trials in Milwaukee. Amber is also a recent recipient of the American Bar Foundation Law and Inequality Fellowship and the Ruth Peterson Fellowship. So, Amber.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for everyone who's attended today. It's really just such an honor to be here and to engage in this conversation with such an amazing group of scholars. So I'm very honored, and I really think this is going to be such a productive conversation. So yeah, again, I'm a sociology PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota. Much of the work that I've done really sort of can be categorized I've done a lot of work on policing and gender-based violence. And so there's sort of two major projects that I'm doing in this moment. And the first one is my dissertation study, which is a qualitative examination of sexual victimization inside of youth detention facilities. And so what I'm doing is, with the help of organizations in the community, is really asking young adults who've been inside of the juvenile justice system what their experience is with sexual assault and sexual abuse, and how they're making sense of sexual violation in these spaces. And I think it's important to sort of highlight carceral organizations within the context of gender-based violence, because so much of the discussion around rehabilitation is sort of looking at these sites, residential facilities, group homes, juvenile justice centers, as sites of rehabilitation, as sites where youth can become productive citizens. And what the research that I'm doing is very clearly showing that no, not only are these sites not rehabilitative, they're also producing violence, and they're concealing that violence against youth, and particularly youth of color and queer youth as well. So that's sort of one of the studies that I'm doing. And the second one is actually a study on policing in Minneapolis. And this study was, this is before all of the recent uprisings. We started this with Dr. Michelle Phelps in 2017. And we, at that time, it was sort of at the back end of another uprising in Minneapolis in 2015, which was the Jamar Clark shooting. And that was also I believe it was an 18-day occupation of one of the precincts in Minneapolis. And so when we were talking to residents, we talked to about 112 residents, and we were talking to them, Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, those names were very much on their minds. And so we were asking them questions about, you know, what do you think about your neighborhood safety? What is your relationship like with police? But also asking about that current moment, about the high profile cases that they were seeing. We were asking, you know, what their relationship was like with local activists, and whether or not they felt like those activists were sort of representing their interests. And we got a lot. People were sort of all over the place. But one of the interesting findings from that was actually there were several white folks who were also in the study. And when you talk to the Black folks, you know, while the high profile cases were shocking, while they were devastating, while they were painful, it reaffirmed what was long known, you know, the experiences that they had had for, you know, years and decades before that. But for the white folks who are living in this like spatial proximity to Black folks, it was new for them. A lot of it was new for them. You know, seeing Philando Castile or even Eric Gardner or some of these other folks was sort of a new turning point for them to start thinking about racism in the ways that Black folks have. And then I'm also sort of diving deeper into women's experiences with police violence as well, and sort of doing a study between Black and white women's experiences with violence. And we know that Black women in particular go through what Beth Ritchie calls the violence matrix, where they're trying to simultaneously navigate interpersonal violence, they're navigating the neighborhood violence, but they're also navigating that police violence. And that matrix makes it very difficult for them to feel comfortable utilizing police as a resource, but at the same time feeling like there's no other resource around that can effectively address those issues. And so that's kind of what I was focusing on. And then, you know, this moment really hit close for me, because as I'm doing that work, I was in Minneapolis when George Floyd died. And I think it was just a lot of us were struggling with that, because I felt like the research wasn't enough. I wanted to be out there on the front lines and doing something, but at the same time, there's COVID, right? There's COVID, and it's like, can I afford to be tear gassed? If I get something, can I afford to bring that back home to my family? Because we know that those things COVID is disproportionately experienced by Black and Brown communities. So that was kind of the struggle that I know a lot of us were dealing with at the time. And so that really has me thinking, as a scholar who has done a lot of work on sexual violence and has done a lot of work on policing, what can I do in this moment, and what am I encouraged by in this moment? And it's been heartening to see more people talking about defunding the police, and not only defunding the police or abolishing the police, but thinking of public safety alternatives. And so as a Black feminist scholar who studies sexual violence, one of the things that I always hear, especially recently, that people sort of use to say why we need police is, well, what about sexual assault? What about rape? Who's going to handle domestic violence if we get rid of police? And you hear that from people who are very well-intentioned, perhaps, when they say that, but it relies on this problematic assumption that what police are already doing is effective. And I think the research that I've done over the course of, I looked at sexual assault trials in Milwaukee and my dissertation research and the policing research. What you see in each one of those projects is that what police are doing to address gender-based violence is largely not effective. Yes, they can provide some sort of immediate assistance to people short-term, but in the long term, people are largely still don't trust police, and that is directly related to, like in the policing project, this idea that police aren't being held accountable. So if a police officer shows up, they might have a positive experience. One woman, for example, credits the police for saving her life in an instance of domestic violence, but then she says, but they're not being held accountable. Philando Castile's murderers are still out there, so I don't trust them. So those like moments of, I know what Monica Bell calls situational trust, don't actually repair the harm that a lot of these community has, in particular, like women of color, around like interpersonal violence. And I see the same thing again in the dissertation study, where it sort of started off as a study about sexual violence in these facilities. But what I'm really realizing is before you even get there, they're talking about sexual violence in the family. They're talking about sexual violence in the foster care system, sex trafficking, schools. And so by the time they get to these juvenile justice institutions, the sexual violence by the institution is already normalized. It's already there. And it's perhaps to them, in their minds, not quite as big of a deal as perhaps some of those other forms of violence. And so I've been sort of following up and asking, well, what about your relationship with police? Do you see police as a protective force? And, you know, the answer you always get is absolutely not. Police, in a lot of those cases for those people, are the people who are perpetuating the sexual violence or the gender-based violence. And so if there's something that I could, you know, bring to the conversation and really try to move academics to think about is, as feminist scholars, we need to be at the forefront of talking about punishment, of talking about mass incarceration, of talking about, you know, the ways in which police are marginalizing these communities. We know in the past that white feminist sort of mainstream movements have moved away from the radical roots and have focused more on how we can reform police. How do we make police nicer so that when they show up to the domestic violence call, they do the right thing? And I think that research, the direction that research has to go into at this point, is thinking about what are those other public safety alternatives. And we don't even know, because, you know, as was kind of already mentioned on the panel, it's, you know, studying abolition is still very sort of marginalized in these communities. The focus is on sort of the actual formalized criminal justice system. And so there's still, at least in sociology, isn't a whole lot of work of like what some of these models might look like. So moving forward, I think that would be what I would want to see. And I'll just go ahead and stop there.
I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Amber. Much appreciated. And starting to get a few questions into the chat, but I actually wanted to give you all an opportunity to kind of talk to each other or kind of address points that have come up in you all's presentations, but possibly I was curious if you might be able to just just elaborate a bit on what you've spoken to, but I'm, I guess, most curious in terms of what the last several months of protest and really discussion about very kind of like nuts and bolts kind of criminal justice issues has made you think about your own research. And Amber, you did a pretty wonderful job of kind of like raising this point at the end of your presentation. But whether you or anyone else wants to kind of build on it, I'm just curious in terms of what are the ways in which the moment that we've all been living through over the past several months how has it made you think about your own research and perhaps think about the ways in which our public conversations could be informed by your research, or maybe how your research needs to, how is it maybe shaped and informed or reaffirmed some of your own research interests? I'll just open it up.
I think for me, and I'll talk about the research in a second, but I also wanted to touch a little bit on teaching. I think it's made me rethink a lot about how we teach. And Dr. Gonzalez and Cleve mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I think right now in the discipline, we as a discipline, whether it's criminology or sociologists who study crime, we are part of a sort of pipeline to the corrections workforce, right? And it's got me really thinking, like, how do we dismantle that in terms of what kinds of classes are we offering? What, are we inviting police officers into our classrooms? Are we sort of actively marketing those types of professions in the classrooms and things like that? So I think on that end, that's kind of one of the things that I'm thinking about. As for the research, I have to be honest, I didn't start my research journey as an abolitionist. I started doing court ethnography on sexual assault trials with youth, and watching those trials, it's not that you didn't see racism, like you saw all of those things, it was very clear in your face, but it didn't feel quite as bad because you felt like people were so bad at the time. And I think sort of working through that work and sort of getting to going through the policing work that I've done and doing the dissertation work now, and sort of looking back on that experience, it really solidifies that the issue is not with like the individual, right? That it's not about these sort of individual bad, evil monsters or bad actors, right? Like, again, what are the conditions that produce this sort of violence? And we know that the courts, we know that corrections, we know that policing doesn't do that. And I think for me, the last few months, that's really been solidified in my head, because I have to be reminded of that. I have to be reminded of that, because it can be very easy to think of sexual violence as the one thing that's like, nope, we need them for that. We don't need them for all that other stuff, but we need them for this. And I need to be reminded constantly that, no, we don't need them for this either. And I think I've been really encouraged by that and challenged to be more part of that. So.
I think for me, just to echo, I was on a panel, it's called the Square One Project, that Bruce Western and Jeremy Travis organized, and Khalil Gibran Mohammed did this wonderful presentation about his work, The Condemnation of Blackness, but also how from historical empirical data, we know that these systems have long, deep roots, right? The systems we see today have roots in history, and that is pretty much, on so many different levels, we can trace it and talk about it. And I made a comment, and it was retweeted, or it was, live tweeted. And I said, criminal justice departments need to redesign most of their education. There used to be historians in criminal justice departments, and now they're gone. They retired and they stopped hiring them. Most graduate programs do not require any class on race. And let me be very clear what I'm talking about. I'm not saying how to control for race as some kind of independent variable. That's not it. That means that you understand, like, something as robust as a condemnation of Blackness, and how the very data that we collect is largely constructed with the historical narrative. We've collapsed whiteness into one thing and not seen the textures between. Most criminologists have come out of these programs not understanding that, not reading across fields, right? Not reading law and society literature, not reading sociology, not reading African American perspectives. And so when you do that, I mean, I guess it makes sense that you send students out there that are completely unaware of what they don't know. And I think that to me is a major issue. Now, so many people went after me on Twitter. It was like the criminal justice is, at that time, it was probably a year ago. You can look at all the people. How could she say this? It's going to deter us, young people of color from wanting to study in crim departments. I was like, well, most of them are getting pushed out anyway. They're not finishing these crim departments because the moment they bring a project that is something interesting, like what is the experience of transgender people of color and being over policed or not being treated as victims, they pitch that to a crim program, and many crim programs says that's not criminology. And I'm thinking, how is that not criminology? That to me is about victimization. That's about police and how they understand who is a victim, who's not a victim. That's racial profiling, gender profiling. I mean, it is a rigorous question that I don't know the answer to, and I don't think criminology has papers on that. So when a grad student pitches me that paper, I'm like, wow, you have a vision of something that we've not seen. But the institutions in many criminal justice departments would dissuade that from existing. And then that student would go off looking as though they're a failure. But we need to see how the institutions themselves replicate themselves, right? And then they become hospitable for only a type of scholar that does not want to engage deeply on race and racism. So when I said, it was difficult to publish criminal justice through colorblind lenses, that was true. That article to me was theoretically important based on what I saw in the field. And it felt like it needed to be said. And then that article became a stepping stone to publishing a criminology piece that got accepted in the flagship journal that was critical and talks about intersectional prejudices about welfare, intersectional prejudice about race, class, gender that are mobilized against people in courts and jails in 2 different jurisdictions. It's a comparative ethnography. So we tried to up the ante on the methods and the empirical work that we do to push the claims, but it is like fighting. We should not have to fight so hard, right? We should not have to fight so hard, and we shouldn't have to, for Kayla's honesty about, it's hard to think about being in a crim program. I would say stay true to your values and continue to do the empirical work that just shows how talented you are as a scholar. That way your tenure file reflects your values. And look where we are in society. All the people that were like, how could she say that? Everybody seems woke now. They're all saying they need to study race. And I'm like, wait a second, where were you 5 years ago when you said racism wasn't a thing? And how do you measure it? So again, sometimes, I hope, my faith is in the positive, optimistic part. I think about someone like Angela Davis, who's been doing this work, and I think, how does she keep going after all those years? How does she do it? How is she in Oakland still protesting and still speaking truth to the power? And how does she do it? Well, I've never seen her, turn away from her value system, from the work. And that's what I hope younger scholars, I think that's the lesson that many of our ancestors and elders can teach us.
Kayla, Nathalie, any thoughts in terms of how the recent wave of protests have either had you think about your scholarship differently, or how your scholarship has made you think about those protests?
I'll go. So the protests and everything that was happening, I feel like the work that we do, especially people who do race work, we do it every day, and especially people of color who do race work, we do it every day, every single waking moment of our lives. So the entire thing with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, it was difficult because it was like everybody else was awoken at that point, and everybody else wanted to talk about it, and everybody else wanted to, strategize and think about what they can do. So I think that was the most overbearing thing for me, as a scholar and as just like as a human being, because then I had to have conversations with people I'm not used to having conversations like this with. And in terms of the actual work, I do believe that it has made me more critical, and more radical. Not radical, but more so rational. I don't like the term radical because I feel like, this is like rational thinking, like this is how it's supposed to happen. But I think that it has made me a lot more vocal, in terms of my feelings and my true thoughts on race and policing, and particularly how policing can and cannot be reformed. And I have been much more open to the conversations around police abolition and defunding and stuff like that, because obviously we've had reforms for, policing has been around since the 1800s, and we've had reforms each and every time fail, like continuously fail. Professionalism failed, diversity hiring failed, consent decrees, monitoring use of force, they continue to fail. So I do think that it has informed my work in ways that has made me much more critical and open to being critical and less fearful of being critical. And I think that right now is the time to actually be that way, because it's like, everybody is awoken, everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. Companies are now apologizing for certain things that they do. The Redskins, the Washington Redskins just changed their name. So I think that this is such a great political moment for people doing race and criminal justice work to actually just be who they are in their true selves. And I just feel like this moment in time is such a tragic but perfect moment to have this conversation about how do we move forward. And I don't think that if COVID didn't happen, and the killings of Ahmaud, Breonna, George, as well as the countless other victims of police violence during that time, I don't think that we would actually be having this conversation so critically. I mean, like, I live around the corner from where protests really happen. I live in Philly, and things really popped off around here. National Guard was around here, so it's just like this really amazing time to be a Black scholar studying policing in so many different ways.
I just wanted to jump in real quick, just to say I resonated a lot with what Kayla was saying of just how this moment is just like illuminating a lot, and it just is a very like salient moment to really change and seeing just like so much change already happening. And I think for me, just seeing the protests and mass uprisings here and globally that have been going on for years right now, but for us kind of joining in this right now and understanding ourselves as globally connected to how different systems of oppression operate. For me, that understanding right now in our mass uprisings and with my research is just affirming the necessity of embodying more and embodying abolition as a praxis that can get us towards the liberated society and the world that we're looking for. And like Kayla was saying, like, we've gone through so many different moments of reform that have brought us to this moment right here where we're still dealing with the same things that we've been dealing with for decades. And I think, seeing just the ways that, although it is frustrating to see people kind of jump on the bandwagon, it is very hopeful in the sense that people are waking up and people are no longer just accepting the status quo anymore. And that was a huge part of my research in terms of theoretically, like, understanding how people accept things in society, and how the acceptance, really, as simple as it sounds, is really so huge, in that you can just sit back and just like consent to things like implicitly if you're not going out protesting, if you're not posting online, if you can't go out to protest, not posting online, educating people, talking with your family, like those things, if you're not doing those things, you are implicitly consenting to the ways that our society is operating. And so seeing the ways that people are rejecting that right now is super hopeful. And I think I was watching this webinar a couple weeks ago that Critical Resistance did, and you know, they were saying like this moment, it's not guaranteed that we'll get out of this moment in a way that is that we're free, but I think there's a lot of potential now, and I think our research and the organizing and uprisings are part of that potential, and it's up to us to figure out and to be serious about where we want to go from here.
Cool. Started to get a couple more questions in the chat, but I want to ask a quick, just one other quick question before we turn to the chat. And it really has to do with, I feel like, the ways in which we've talked about race at this moment in time. And, you know, for some of you, kind of the question of race is sort of, well, for all of you, the question of race is really central to your research. I think one of the things that the waves of protests that have broken out have forced a lot of folks, particularly a lot of white folks, but really many people in society, to kind of try to reckon with and make sense of is the way in which race works. One of the things that I'm curious about is how you all, if you had a magic wand, and I know nobody here has a magic wand, but if you had a magic wand, not asking you to like fix the way society works necessarily, although that would be great if that's the way that you used your magic wand. But if you could change the way in which we understand how race works, or we understand kind of like the dynamics of race and racism, whether it's around the criminal justice system specifically or just more broadly, kind of building on your insights as a scholar, what would you wave your magic wand to do? So basically, how would you draw on the ways in which your research has led you to understand the way in which race works in a particular, race and racism works in a particular way? Kind of what would you want the rest of us to really understand and be able to kind of learn from in terms of those kind of like that scholarly work?
I mean, for me, I have two pet peeves right now from what I'm seeing. There are people saying that racism in policing is structural racism in policing, as though we inherited this racism and no one's to blame. That's you know, so something in the structure of how things are organized. And then there's another subset of people who would say it's implicit bias. We all have implicit biases. And so it's just not conscious, but we can understand how this could happen. And I'm thinking, well, wait, think about what happened to Philando Castile. He was stopped 52 times before he was sitting there and encountered one deadly officer, right? And so I think, to me, it is a cultural practice of racism, that racism can be cultural, right? We can say words like, look at that mope over there, and it's recoded. And when you think of these racialized categories that become culturally ingrained and we use them over and over again, to me, you start to just internalize it as normal. So in Crook County, you have defense attorneys that are saying things in plea bargains like, hang him, string him, I don't care what you do with him, judge. That sounds a whole lot like lynching language. And so the idea that we can pass culture through generations, yes, of course, there's structural inequalities and structural racism. And yes, of course, we can have implicit biases on a cognitive level. But Philando Castile was not killed by, you know, what stopped him 52 times was something that was overt and cultural and practiced and reinforced. And the same thing, you do not kill George Floyd for 8 minutes and have people walking around and normalizing it like it's nothing unless everybody sees with the same eyes, right? In Chicago, they brought a woman out, a mentally ill woman, in bond court wearing nothing but a garbage bag. She was arrested, brought to the precinct, brought to the Cook County Jail, talked to a public defender, went to a social worker, brought to open court, saw the prosecutors, saw the prosecutor, saw the public defender, saw the judge. And it was only through court watching with the Illinois Supreme Court judge who happened to be in the audience to see that this Supreme Court judge was the only person that thought this was strange. Meaning, what does it take, right? That's where racism, I think, takes over. You normalize that for a Black woman to be brought out in a garbage bag without dignity. That, to me, is what we need to come to terms with. This, you would not see a white person with a boot on their neck for 8 minutes, right? Similar to Abu Ghraib, we would not see white people in cages like dogs, right? These are the racial underpinnings that we need to contend with, that are in our cultural brains, that allows it to be normalized as though it's natural, and that we have to disassemble that for it to be reformed.
Yeah, I think the big point for me, and what I would point to as my work, is sort of recognizing how racism is also gendered and sexualized. And I think one of the things that I've also been really encouraged about in this moment, that while we're talking about Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, that we're also talking about Breonna Taylor. And I know, like, to say her, the movement around Black women that that's been going on for quite some time. But I really feel like in this moment, people keep saying, but don't forget to arrest the people who've killed Breonna Taylor. And that's something that I've been really encouraged by. I think, when we talk, and Black feminists have talked about this for years, that when we talk about racism, or when we talk about racialized violence, that there's an assumed target, that assumed target is a Black man. And we see in the work that I've done, people talk about this. So when Black women are talking about their experiences, they're sort of putting themselves on this hierarchy, where Black men, they say, well, they have it worse. So yeah, this was bad for me, but they have it much worse. But they also sort of put white women on the side of that and say, oh, but if I was a white woman, it would be so much better. So they kind of have themselves, a lot of them talk about their experiences sort of being nestled in between both Black men and white women. And I think we have to understand that racism operates differently across race, across gender, across different sexualities. And I just think we have to be more open in talking about that, and thinking about not sort of putting those on a hierarchy of what's better, or whose oppression is worse, or which violence is worse, but just thinking about how it might operate a little bit differently in those contexts.
I think for me, and the one thing that came out of my research was the idea of this monolithic Blackness. So I think the wider world has this idea that Blackness has to be this one thing, when in reality it's such a fluid category. So you have like the Candace Owens of the world, and you also have the Killer Mikes of the world, and you have the Patricia Collins of the world. So I think that if I had a magic wand, it would be to help people understand that just because, you have representation, so to speak, this diversity, so to speak, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually diverse. So if we take, for example, in my work on policing, Milwaukee Sheriff David Clark, who is an avid supporter of Trump, who was kicked off of Fox News for his too far right-wing ideologies, like this idea that, okay, so we're just going to throw some diversity in there. And this diversity may not actually be what these people, what we actually need, or what people want, or what reflects the needs of the people. So if I could communicate one thing, it's just to open your mind to the fact that Blackness is not this just one thing. It's not like this criminal person. It's not this person that you see before you. It's just such a fluid category that people have to acknowledge that in order to move forward in conversations around representation, around conversations of diversity. And I really don't like the term diversity, because I think that it's kind of like this blanketed statement that says, okay, here's diversity. We have a couple Black faces, we have a couple brown faces, so then we can move on. But in reality, that's just not how it is. We have to have representatives of the community. And I guess this is where like police abolition comes into play and defunding the police comes into play, because we have to make a shift from looking at people to looking at individual people and saying, okay, this person can be the representative of this entire place, when in reality, this person has no clue of what's actually going on in this particular community. So I think that would be the one thing that I communicated.
Cool. And thank you for that. Thank you all. And not trying to put you all in the hot seat, but I know beyond just thinking about this as a magic wand, this is work that you all are already doing in terms of trying to change kind of societal views you are already doing or will definitely be doing in the future. And I wanted to draw briefly from the chat to kind of give you all an opportunity to speak further. One, we had a question from Kalfani Toure, and just a brief question that, one, there seems to be some momentum around trying to take questions of criminal justice reform and even abolition seriously. But what do individuals do to ensure that folks remain active and committed to social change and reform? And then we had another question, and we'll probably just take two at a time, from Donna Corker, who isn't on the call anymore, but will probably see the recording. And they were asking, my anecdotal experience in conversations with Black officers who are engaged in restorative justice work is that they believe that it is critical that they stay there to moderate the otherwise harmful treatment of youth. This is mostly for Kayla. Kayla, do you find any that thought that way in terms of your field work? So maybe let's start with those two questions, and then we'll come back.
So I can speak to the second question, and then I guess we can get back to the first question. I do find in my work that there are some Black officers who are there for the purpose of being representatives of the community and who are there to actually help the community. They don't see policing just as a job. They see policing as a means to assist the community in its development and growth and actually having a voice within the police department. So I do find that there are officers that are there committed to social justice, committed to racial justice and everything like that. But the problem that I find is that in the policing organization as a whole, it's not an organization that's committed to racial justice. If anything, it's an organization that is arguably committed to reinforcing the racial hierarchy in so many different ways. And so even those actors, those individual actors within the police department, the police organization, who might try to implement change. How do you implement change when you have your supervisors down your neck, when you have even citizens down your neck for being an actual police officer? You have this this black and blue tension, whereas though you have to do your job, and if you don't do your job, then you'll lose your livelihood, right? You'll lose your job, you'll lose your house, you'll lose your means of living. But you also have a commitment to this racialized community, and that was your reason for actually joining the police department. So that's all to say, I do find that officers are committed to racial justice, but within the confines of the police department, I find that racial justice sometimes gets convoluted, whereas though, an officer might do something that may not necessarily be perceived as harmful because they're Black. So they take that for granted, that taken for granted status of being a Black police officer in a Black community, something that they might do might not be seen as offensive or less professional because they are Black, when in reality, the things that they're doing are just as harmful as white officers who are also there in that community, or Black officers who aren't committed to racial justice in that community. So
So thank you. And then we're pretty close to time. So I want to give all of our panelists a chance to maybe sum up, and if they can, to touch on this question that I asked that was basically really focused on what individuals might be able to do to keep folks really, I think in some ways, from getting discouraged, right? And from feeling frustrated about the slow pace of change, or pessimistic about the prospects that anything regarding our status quo might end up differently. So maybe if you all could, I'm not asking you all to give us like a halftime speech in terms of trying to get us to feel better about where we are, but if you all have any maybe closing thoughts, but particularly in terms of what individuals who are joining us or maybe watching the recording can look to do as a way to encourage themselves and encourage others to not necessarily to give up hope, because sometimes these are topics that can leave individuals feeling discouraged. And then lastly, I just want to give a quick reminder that the call is being recorded, and that the recording of this call should be posted on the website for the Center for Justice, Law, and Society by this evening. So the web address for the center was posted in the chat earlier, and we'll make sure it's posted by the end of the call. And once we finish up, I'll say it for those who are watching the recording so they have an idea of what it is. Now I'm going to pass it over to the panelists. And again, if you have any final thoughts, and also any words of advice or kind of insights from your scholarship that would help the rest of us not to feel necessarily overwhelmed, or help us to kind of encourage our friends and families to kind of remain committed to trying to make this world a little bit of a better place.
Should you call on us, or?
No, I'm leaving it open. I don't want to. I'm not. Summer. It's not classroom experience, so I'm not gonna.
I'll say again. Remember, I was saying I was like the old woman on the panel today. But I would say that grad school and early in your tenure track, you are training, right? You are working, but that doesn't mean that you can't continue to have your own values. And I think one of the things when I talk about sociological malpractice of staying silent, what I want people to think about is the importance of this idea of public facing scholarship. And to me, that, I understand that in some corners, there's parts of academia that doesn't value it. But, I think for me, that's been one of the most rewarding things that I feel like I can do. And to me, it's directly related to pedagogy. If we can, lecture an undergraduate class of 100 or 120, why aren't we also thinking of the public work we do, whether it's writing an op-ed, whether it's hosting a podcast or participating on media, TV, whatever avenue you feel most comfortable? That is part of what we are tasked to do as educators. And I think right now, I think we can see the toll of staying silent. And my hope is that right now, as we're seeing changes in norms, I hope it pushes the academy to think differently about what our roles and responsibilities are. And so for some people, that might be activism, marching in the street, helping people organize. For others, it might take different forms and shapes. But I guarantee by doing that, you will feel more empowered and real. And maybe that's the secret to Angela Davis's longevity, right? How do we find ways to not just be sleepy academics in a tower, but be out there and revealing power, speaking truth. I think that to me is an important guiding principle for me.
Yeah, I think just to echo that, I guess my call would be to be for people who are in positions of power to, especially in the academy, to support, Black graduate students and other students of color, because like there is a lot of fatigue. There's a lot of fatigue in doing this work, and people Joyce Bell told me this once, people have to survive in different ways. And so for some people, they can be out on the front lines every day. For some people, they have to take a break. You know, it's difficult and we all handle it in different ways. But having structures behind us that are doing the work when we're, you know, too tired, or that are supporting us, that are investing financially, right, in these projects that we want to do, giving us good mentorship and all of those things. When we have that, I think it allows us to be able to keep on doing that work. But when it's discouraged, when there's no financial funds for it, when there's no network of people you can talk to doing similar work, right? When there's, you know, when all of that is missing, it doesn't allow us to be able to keep that, sort of keep that momentum going. So that's just, I guess, my call just for people in positions of power is like, support us, you know?
I would just say that I think, you know, like what we were saying, there isn't one way to engage in liberation work right now, and that we all need to be like doing our part of like what that looks like and pushing ourselves to do more. And I think part of sustaining the hope of that is that constant like renewal of understanding our stake in this moment, understanding the the necessity of fighting for freedom, fighting for a world where we can live free, where our neighbors can live free, where our children who are to come can live free as well. So I think it's understanding that we have like that power to do that, and that it is our duty to do that, and understanding that, constantly renewing like our value systems, understanding our value systems, really engaging with that. I think also what Amber was saying of having a community of people who are also engaged in that work, that so when you're feeling pessimistic, when you're feeling down and not seeing things moving, that you have a community to fall back on, and that will sustain the hope as well. And I think also just constantly engaging in our own like self-education as well, especially, you know, this room is filled with scholars, people of academics, and I think it's also important for us to also engage in our own like critical self-reflection, our own self-education, so that we know more of what this moment calls for, and know more of how to move better in the work that is necessary right now.
I'll make mine quick, and kind of following this critical reflection. I think that the most important thing right now, and not even just within this call, but like in the world, is for people to acknowledge their privilege, to acknowledge their positionality and use their positionality to impact change. It's easy to, you know, talk about anti-Black racism and, you know, also not acknowledge your part in anti-Black racism. So I think that conversations within the white community have to happen around privilege, around how you perpetuate racialized, maybe not physical violence, but mental violence in your day-to-day interactions with people of color. And regardless if you want to acknowledge it or not, just know that it probably 99% of the time does happen, regardless of how careful you might be. So I think that one of the most important things, again, is to just acknowledge that privilege, to explore that privilege in a way that is very challenging to yourself, and let yourself be uncomfortable, let yourself kind of fall into this, like, well, damn, like this is a real thing. This white privilege is a real thing and I possess it. And what can I do to how can I use my privilege in ways that aren't just beneficial to me, but are beneficial to communities that are being oppressed in so many different ways.
Cool. Thank you. I like the way you all frame that. And really, really, I don't know about anybody else, but I am very not a fan of criminal justice scholarship generally. Definitely have my historian's hat on, but very inspired by like the future course of direction in terms of that scholarly work. Just hearing you all speak, and just want to commend you all for being willing to think kind of outside of the ivory tower, which hopefully more of us get better at not getting stuck in, if that makes any sense, and really find ways to sort of step outside of and really try to find ways to be on the front lines, as the title of today's event suggests. Just a quick reminder, the recording from this webinar panel is going to be available at the website for the UMass Amherst Center for Justice, Law, and Societies. That's UMassCJLS.org. So all one word, essentially. So UMassCJLS.org is where the recording will be hosted. And hopefully this will be the first of multiple different conversations that we'll be able to draw in, including scholars, community members, practitioners, that really kind of give us a sense of how folks like yourselves on the front lines of these issues are thinking about them, and really giving us an opportunity to draw on your expertise and figure out what we can do to try to change the world that we live in. So I want to thank you all. Jamie Rowan, if you want to close us out with any final thoughts or comments.
Thank you. No need. You all said it all. Thank you so much for joining. I hope we see you in an event in the future. Thank you so much, Professor Losier. That's actually what I should say too. Thank you so much for your time and your excellent moderation. This was excellent. Thank you all for joining and spending your Wednesday afternoon with us.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all. Take care.
Thanks.
Really, guys, thanks again. Thank you so much, Toussant.
No problem. My pleasure. I'm glad they came together pretty well, and